Yo, YouTube, how's it going? Monday, November 5th. Meant to do this video yesterday, but I hopped onto the Patriot Soapbox channel, hung out with them for a little bit, meant to only be there a few minutes, ended up talking to them for like 2+ hours about all sorts of cool stuff. Shout out to JT Wild for getting me on there and all the other neat guys I was talking to. But anyway, here we are, Monday, and I want to discuss with you guys the Pentagon Audit coming soon, and the Navy's potential role in the Space Force, how that might be playing into the disclosure of Navy's secret space programs and other things. We'll make some intriguing connections there. But let's start Pentagon Audit. I'm going to show you guys a Bloomberg article that came out about a week ago, and it says, Pentagon girds for audit backlash that may echo the $435 hammer era. Now, the $435 hammer era, first of all, references back to the 1980s when something was publicized, hit the mainstream, called the Spinney Report, authored by Franklin Spinney. And in this report, Franklin Spinney was a budget analyst in the Pentagon, and he was noticing how much money was being wasted on stuff that really wasn't that expensive. A hammer for $435. For those of you that follow Q, this idea was actually said very early on, almost a year ago now, exactly. Q was referencing $15,000 for a toothbrush, right? Who audits? Nobody. Nobody's ever audited the Department of Defense. Never happened, okay? And again, for those of you that have seen Independence Day, same thing in there. $40,000 for a hammer.
You don't actually think they spend $20,000 on a hammer?
Truth in plain sight. Now, here's the interesting thing. Pentagon's never been audited before, but the very first audit that's ever happened to the Pentagon is underway right now. It's actually been going on for the last year, very quietly, very quietly. This is an article from late 2017, almost a year ago. Pentagon announces first ever audit of the Department of Defense. Like I said, very, very quiet. One of the only stories we've heard leak into the news this past year about that audit has been about this right here. Pentagon audit shows logistical arm of military can't explain where $800 million went, nearly $1 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but in a minute here, we're going to actually talk about how much money we're expecting to be shown missing or unaccounted for within the Pentagon. But let's get back to this audit here. So Pentagon braces for the impact of this audit. The findings of the audit are actually supposed to be released in only about 10 days, 11 days, November 15th or 16th, as per Comptroller David Norquist. So only 10 or 11 days now since the findings of that audit are supposed to come out. It's very close, and I wonder if that fits in perfectly to all the plans going on behind the scenes right now. So 10, 11 days, we're supposed to hear about this audit. This audit we haven't really heard all that much about for the past year, about $1 billion gone. Now let's talk about how much money we're expecting to be announced in the findings of that audit. So you might be saying to yourself, holy crap, they don't know where $1 billion went. $1 billion, right? If that happened to anybody else, any other branch of government, people would be up in arms. $1 billion? But from the Pentagon, this is actually a drop in the bucket. Back in 2016, only about 2.5 years ago, there was a report released by the Defense Department's Inspector General, and it said that the Army, in 1 year alone, made $6.5 trillion in what they called wrongful adjustments or improper accounting adjustments. Various, we could say, excuses, various jargon used to call it what it is, basically the swiping, the stealing, the laundering of money. 6.5 trillion 2 years ago. Now, if you remember, if you've heard of this, the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld admitted to $2.3 trillion in these improper adjustments, basically missing money from the Pentagon. This is the day before 9/11. Of course, 9/11 happened. We all forget that number grew to 6.5 trillion, as you can see here in 2016. Some people out there are saying that that number might very well be up to even $20 trillion, more or less. I'm not sure about the 2021 trillion that's floating around, but we could say, as per official sources, at least 6.5 trillion is missing. So that's with a T, guys, with a T. $1 trillion. That's just not 800 million or 1 billion, 6.5. So I'm curious if we're going to see that full number, 6.5 plus trillion, admitted here on November 15th or 16th. Maybe, maybe not. On one hand, if they don't tell us it's that full amount, I would understand. That's pretty shocking for the American public, But at the very same time, they might be preparing us for a number to come out that is that big. Check this article out. Again, a very recent one out within the past few days. The Air Force can't explain why it spent $1,300 on a coffee cup. $1,300 on a freaking French press coffee cup. Senator Chuck Grassley finally received a response from the Air Force about why it was spending so much money on a freaking coffee cup. Now, a couple things with this one. Number one, $1,300 on a coffee cup. That's a little bit more than the $500 on a Hammer era a couple decades ago. We're up to $1,300 on a coffee cup. So they might be prepping us to learn about some amounts that are a little bit more than just the 800 million. We might be hearing about quite a bit amount of money that's missing. Number two, interesting, Chuck Grassley finally received a response from the Air Force. If you actually notice, Chuck Grassley, this article actually mentions him. He has been a massive outspoken critic on the topic for decades now, actually decades. Chuck Grassley was the one who helped publicize this $500 Hammer era, helped publicize that Spinney report. It was Chuck Grassley who made some very crucial moves back in the 80s to get this report out to the public. So Chuck Grassley, Patriot, white hat, mentioned in Q's drops. He's definitely a part of this particular plan, in my opinion, trying to expose the deep state's missing Pentagon money, what they do with it, where does it go, why do they have to spend so much on coffee cups and toothbrushes and hammers. So Chuck Grassley for decades has been trying to help this come out, and he's a pivotal part of this recent news as to why $1,300 on coffee cups is being spent by the Air Force. Look at this. $300,000 in the last 3 years just on coffee cups by the Air Force. Coffee cups. What about all the rest of the stuff? How much of that money has been swiped away and then the budget books are just improper counting adjustment. Oh, let's just make those numbers the same in the computer. Done. So that's that, guys. I'm really interested to see what comes out about this Pentagon audit in just 10 or 11 days. Will it be a huge amount? Maybe. Will it be smaller? Maybe. We'll see what the plan entails. Chuck Grassley looking like he's instrumental in bringing this stuff out. And yeah, there we go, guys. Another thing we're waiting for. Along with the midterms, along with the outcome of that, D-class. I wonder if this D-class falls right in line. So that's what I have to say about the Pentagon audit. Now let's get into the Space Force. Navy expects major role in new Space Force. This was, again, another recent article coming out in National Defense Magazine, and it's basically discussing how a couple higher-up officials in the Navy were saying that, yeah, we might have a pretty big role in the Space Force. And it says right here, however, the Navy's exact role in a new Space Force has yet to be determined, but it remains an open question. They're kind of putting the idea out there. The Navy might take a major role. Now, this is interesting for me personally, any of the others out there that are really hard into secret space program research, because it's on a public level often said that the Air Force has anything in the air, anything in space. That's the Air Force's domain because they fly. But again, if you actually look at the underground stuff, the underground research, the Navy has actually had more of a hand in space in the Black Project realm than the Air Force has. The reason being is because the Navy was able to get some of the research first. I'm going to reference William Tompkins here. William Tompkins, his testimony in our recent movie Above Majestic. I've interviewed him. I have an interview on this channel. That was the very last one he ever did. He used to work in the Navy, Naval Intelligence, and he worked for contractors, particularly Douglas Aircraft, and was designing spacecraft for the Navy even all the way back in the 50s and 60s. Electromagnetic propulsion systems. The Navy had this. Our military had this. Yes, that long ago, and they've been developing it for that long with what looks to be decades of money siphoning. So Tompkins was saying the Navy put in a operational space fleet called Solar Warden in the 1980s. We have evidence of Gary McKinnon, who hacked NASA computers and found this in the year 2001, that the Navy, yes, put out a Solar Warden space fleet that it kept highly classified, and it had non-terrestrial officers on it and a whole fleet of spacecraft. This is back in the 80s. Tompkins even claimed that there's more development going on at this moment, new craft, new fleet. So the Navy has had an upper hand on the Air Force in actuality when it comes to space, okay? For instance, say an Air Force personnel was going to go on a classified mission. They would basically go up, come back, have dinner with their family, be ready for their 9 to 5 the next day, right? The Air Force doesn't have the depth of capability that the Navy would, because the Navy trains for it, and they have the construction capability with their development of submarines to go on longer, more in-depth space operations. The personnel that train on a sub, it's the exact same training that they would need for a space mission, because they're figuring out how to live in a small contained area and be in that for a long period. And not only that, but submarines themselves can be outfitted, retrofitted with electromagnetic propulsion systems. And the modular building of submarines is very similar to the modular building of deep state craft, maybe both. So the Navy's always had an upper hand on the Air Force. Navy expecting a major role in the new Space Force. Interesting, right? Maybe they're trying to disclose some of their classified projects through the Space Force. Trump, with the amount of Navy officials, high-ranking officials around him, Marine generals, Navy admirals around him, does he know these things? Are they positioning themselves as the alliance to operate a full disclosure, not some sort of partial disclosure? Those are the dots that I'm seeing line up. Those are the questions in my mind, okay? And one more thing to add to that, Navy disclosing space programs. Check this out. Deputy Defense Secretary Pat Shanahan was talking Space Force in Seattle in the last week, and he was talking about how the military is going to leverage the tech giants. Basically just giving a speech about Amazon, Microsoft, how all these tech companies in Seattle are going to help the Space Force. Well, what I learned, and some dots that I was connecting in reading this, Deputy Secretary of Defense Pat Shanahan, that's the number 2 in the DoD. That's the guy right under Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis. I didn't realize that Pat Shanahan, I heard the name before, but Pat Shanahan is an ex-Boeing vice president, the ex-VP of Boeing, who was put in place in the role in the DoD in mid-2017. So this guy was brought into the Trump administration being a former VP of Boeing, and now he's playing a huge role, what looks like, in the Space Force. Wow, Boeing, right? Aerospace contractor. Here's the thing. I mentioned William Tompkins a minute ago. Yes? William Tompkins, as per his claims, his testimony, and it checks out, is that he was actually urged by some of his contacts in the Navy to come forward with his story, to start telling about the UFO phenomenon, about the secret space program phenomenon, especially about the Navy's involvement in that. Now, like I mentioned, William Tompkins worked for an aerospace contractor, not just the Navy intelligence during World War II, but also an aerospace contractor in the 50s, Douglas Aircraft, designing stuff, spacecraft for the Navy. Douglas Aircraft later, a couple decades later, became McDonnell Douglas. Those two corporations merged. McDonnell Douglas was acquired by Boeing sometime in the 1990s, I believe. So Boeing absorbed originally, I mean, of course, they built it out over a few decades, but originally, Douglas Aircraft. They had space programs they were working on, as per William Tompkins, as per even others who were finding Solar Warden and evidence of this. So, with the Boeing ex-VP, what does Pat Shanahan know? Does he know about these SSPs? Was he read in on them? Did he have access to them? Boeing VP, very interesting. And now he's a part of the DoD second in command. And now he's talking Space Force. So the Space Force, you guys, and the secret space program is one of the number one topics. Number one topics out there. It's everything to do in the takedown of the deep state and disclosure. We're going to be learning soon what this Pentagon audit is going to bring us. How many, maybe billions, maybe trillions in improper accounting adjustments are found, right? And exposed. First ever audit. We also have what looks to be serious naval connections, serious Boeing and corporate contractor connections to the White Hats, to the alliance, to the Trump administration, and I think they are truly working for a full disclosure. We have naval elements trying to do this. I'm sure many of the Air Force is jumping on board. Again, not black-white thing, but I think the Air Force has more deep state connections in there. Okay, Air Force and CIA, very closely linked. So I think a lot of the Air Force guys are kind of waking up to what's going on, and many of them joining the alliance. But Navy playing a huge part in all of this going on. So that's that, guys. Pentagon Audit, Navy, Secret Space Program, Space Force. If you like the research I do and want some exclusive behind-the-scenes stuff, I do some live chats a couple times a month. Also, I've been doing some giveaways. I have some Ormus to give away and some maps and things like that. Go join my Patreon. Whatever amount, you get access to everything. Doesn't matter. I just appreciate your contributions and your grassroots support for the indie media that I do, these videos and the other projects that I work on. Much of it all comes from my own pocket. So thank you guys. I'll be back soon. That's it for this one.